Michael Fabiano's back with Week 10's start sits for every position. Let's kick it off with quarterbacks, Fabs.
Jared Goff is on the road, and I'm actually going to start him this week. I love the matchup against the LA Chargers. Their defense has really struggled against quarterbacks. 4 have beaten them for at least 24.9 points. So Jared Goff on the road in what should be a high-scoring game is a stardom. I'm also going to start Brock Purdy, and I get it. The numbers of the last few games for Purdy have not been good, but it's a good matchup against the Jaguars. 5 quarterbacks have beaten them for more than 17 fantasy points this season, so start Brock Purdy.
And as far as who you're sitting, you're not trusting Deshaun Watson despite a good showing last weekend.
And Watson has had 18-plus points in 3 of his first 4 full games on the year, so he's been pretty good from a fantasy perspective. But this is a bad matchup against the Baltimore Ravens. Over the last 4 weeks, no team in the league has given up fewer points to quarterbacks than Baltimore. And going back to that Jaguars-49ers game, I'm sitting Trevor Lawrence. I don't know why folks have Lawrence ranked so high. He's averaging 15 points per game. Now, the Niners defense has been bad over the last 3 weeks where they've gone 0-3, but overall, they're still allowing an average of fewer than 14 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. So I am sitting Trevor Lawrence in his glorious locks.
You just sat both my Scott Fishbowl quarterbacks. I'm going to try not to cry about it. Let's move over to the running back position. You say there is hope for Najee Harris.
Yeah, Najee Harris is certainly a player that has been, well, let's just say less than reliable from a fantasy perspective. But look at the numbers lately. 3 straight games, double-digit fantasy points. He's starting to get into the end zone. And the Packers have been bad against running backs. So I'm playing Najee Harris as an RB2 flex. I also like Javonte Williams. Maybe we're starting to get the breakout season for Javonte Williams that some of us predicted. He had 27 rushes in a game before the bye week, which means what? He is getting more of the workload, which means less for Jaleel McLaughlin and Samaje Perine. And the Bills' defense, although it's tough overall, you can run against this team, so Javonte Williams is a nice RB2.
The New York Giants have fallen on some tough times, and it seems like there's only one player you can trust in that offense, but you say, actually, not so fast. Beware Saquon Barkley.
Right, beware Saquon. I know you got to play him. I get it. But the Giants' offensive line is shot. Their quarterback situation is shot. Their offense is shot, and they're playing the best defense in the National Football League in our beloved Dallas Cowboys. I think Barkley could struggle. In fact, Jen, I'm trying to trade Saquon Barkley now before it gets worse. I'm also going to fade Gus Edwards. Gus Edwards has been awesome. This guy has been getting into the end zone at a really high rate. In fact, he has scored 6 touchdowns over his last 3 games, but he's got the Browns this week. Their defense has allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to running backs, only 3 touchdowns allowed all season long. So if you start Gus the Bus, you may want to temper your expectations.
The Niners are back from bye. That's exciting for a lot of us. And also, there's a new quarterback in Tennessee. So you like their receivers?
First off, let's start off with Brandon Ayuk. His numbers haven't been great lately, but I think he's going to put up a very good stat line in what could be a high-scoring game for the Niners. Against the Jacksonville Jaguars, they've been awful against perimeter receivers, allowing the 4th most points to the position, including 77 catches. So Brandon Ayuk's a good play. And Nuke Hopkins was a bit of a disappointment last week, only had 10 points. But did you see what the Houston Texans did to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers last week? I mean, that was incredible. So Nuke Hopkins with Will Levis starting for the Titans looks like he'll be the guy the rest of the season. I like that. From a fantasy standpoint, Nuke Hopkins is a very nice wide receiver too in a plus matchup.
Your first sit on the wide receiver list is breaking my heart. Go ahead, deliver the bad news.
Here's what I hope. That Davante Adams, who is the sit of the week at wide receiver for me, is reverse jinxed back into fantasy relevance. Hey folks, if you looked at Davante Adams' number and didn't look at the name, you would not play this player. He has had single-digit points in 4 of his last 5 games. He's averaging fewer than 10 points per game in his last 5. He's got the Jets this week. It's a brutal matchup. If you've got depth at wide receiver, I know this is blasphemy. I would sit Davante Adams. And George Pickens is another player that I don't love this week. Since Deontay Johnson has come back, Pickens' targets have really gone down. DJ is the wide receiver to start in Pittsburgh. And the matchup's not great against the Packers. They've only given up 2 touchdowns to perimeter receivers this season. So George Pickens suddenly a risk in fantasy land.
And finally, let's get to the suddenly exciting tight end position. We got some of this Texans offense on the list. Give it to us.
Yeah, Dalton Schultz had a very good game last week. We liked him last week, and he was just beautiful from a statistical perspective. And now he's got the Bengals. And the Bengals have allowed the most fantasy points to tight ends. Dalton Kincaid beat him up last week. I think Schultz is a top 10 play this week. I also like Trey McBride. Now, I understand he didn't have a good stat line last week, but this is all about the volume. He's running a lot of routes. He could end up being the second most targeted Cardinals receiver this week behind, of course, Hollywood Brown, and we're getting Kyler Murray back. So start Trey McBride at what's a thin position.
And 2 tight ends you're sitting, both had good weeks last week, but you're saying don't chase the points with this week's matchups.
Right. Musgrave in Green Bay had a nice double-digit performance last week, but he's got Pittsburgh this week. They've allowed 1 touchdown and the 5th fewest fantasy points in tight ends. So beware Luke Musgrave and beware Cade Otton. And Cade Otton has sneaky been okay. He had a huge game last week. He's averaging right around 9 points per game for the season, which isn't bad at the tight end position. But the problem here is the matchup, all right? The Titans defense has allowed only 1 tight end, that's Mark Andrews, to score double digits this year, and he only had 10.9 points against them. So the matchup is selling Cade Otton as a sit this week.
There you have it. For all of Michael Fabiano's start sits for every position, be sure to visit us at si.com/fantasy.